Hearing about getting the most out of early spring forages, selection and management of winter hardy small cereals for silage from Dr. Mary Janowski. Dr. Janowski received both her master's and PhD from North Carolina State University, leading into a postdoc position in feedlot nutrition at Iowa State University. She then spent time as an assistant professor at the University of Idaho before landing in the good life. Dr. Janowski has been with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln since 2014 with the titles Associate Professor and Beef Systems Specialist. She is a part of an interdisciplinary team evaluating economical systems for integrated crop and livestock production in Nebraska. Her current research and extension program is focused on the utilization of crop residues and cover crop forage for backgrounding calves and feeding beef cows. Her participation since the inception of this team has led to valuable research for beef producers to better understand and implement use of crop and systems into their beef production, allowing them to ultimately be more efficient and profitable producers. Dr. Janowski, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Hannah. That was an amazing introduction. You should be a writer.
Well, when you don't send one, you're subject to what I write.
I'll do that more often. Okay, so I thought I would talk a little bit about using winter hardy cover crops, and I'm going to expand out from just silage to spring forage because I wanted to show you some grazing information as well, since I'm not going to be doing that later. So when we're talking about winter hardy species, I think the one everybody really thinks about cereal rye, and we'll talk about cereal rye today. The other ones that might pop up, winter wheat and winter triticale. And in my mind, these are probably the ones that we should be thinking about if we're going to be planting really anytime in September, October time frame for really thinking about spring forage production. I do have one other thing listed, which is hairy vetch. That's really the only overwintering legume that we have as an option. However, I will show you the quality of these grasses can be quite high, and the added crude protein from that hairy vetch really isn't that much benefit from a cattle perspective. Okay, so there are a lot of differences in varieties, and I'm going to be talking mainly about species. So I did want to show you here real quick, though, that especially as we think about cereal rye, the two most common things that you'll probably see is you'll see something where people talk about Elbon rye or a southern rye. It comes out of dormancy earlier, usually about a week earlier than a northern rye, which means that it gets more mature earlier, but it also yields better earlier because it's just going through its growth stages more quickly. Downside to that is that if you happen to be, say in northern Nebraska and you plant it and it does come out of dormancy and then you get a real cold snap, sometimes it can set it back, but I haven't seen instances of it being killed off. So we look at the two here. We have the VNS rye, which honestly in Nebraska tends to be a northern variety, versus Elbon, and you can see the difference in maturity. Yield here is a difference in about a ton of dry matter per acre really early on. This was planted in mid-September, so it was planted pretty early. And you can see down in southern Nebraska, we had some really good yields early on with this Elbon rye. The other thing that's important is planting date will affect yield. And so I do want to point that out, that if we look at where yields start dropping off in the spring because of later planting in the fall, for most of Nebraska, that date's about September 18th, which is much earlier, I think, than people really realize. However, it's important to understand that in this case, it doesn't mean that we can't plant even till November and get reasonable forage production. We're just not going to get as much as we could have. So you think about, we don't get as much bang for the buck. We put in the same seed and we don't get quite as much out of it at the same time frame as we could have if we'd gotten it in earlier. So the bottom line there is maybe think strategically about which fields you're going to plant. Pick those fields that come out earliest, for instance, in early harvested soybeans. Corn silage, of course, makes a lot of sense for these guys. And then maybe anything that you're doing where let's say you're planting a summer annual, you're harvesting it for hay or even silage, might make sense to come in and double crop with one of these winter hardy cereals. But look, even by September 10th in most of Nebraska, we're still at 80% of the yield potential, which is still pretty doggone good. I don't know how far down this would go when we get into November 1st. I'll tell you that we've planted, the first week in November, and we've gotten grazable material in the middle of April, and we could put calves out. And so I do think that while we can reduce yields, it's not a deal breaker when we plant later. You just can't have the same expectations as with earlier planting. What I have here is actually some calves that we put out this spring. We planted this actually the 1st of October. And this is actually some cereal rye that we were on the first week in April. We put out calves when it was about 5 inches tall. And this is what it looked like when we rotated off of it. We were shooting for about 2 inches. And the important thing here to understand is we were trying to keep it very vegetative. So we had 6 calves an acre. And in that process, we actually gave them 2 paddocks. So we rotated between 2 paddocks. So really it came down to a stocking rate of 3 calves an acre, if that makes sense. So that would be really the equivalent to about 1.5 cows an acre, if you want to think about that. So we did hit it pretty hard, and we would rotate back and forth, and it was about a week that they would be on that and rotate. We also had triticale, which is what's on your left here, and wheat, which is on your right. We couldn't get on it until a week later. Both of those kind of came on about the same time frame. All of these winter hardy cereals did get some frost damage, especially while we were out grazing. If we had a frost, wherever the hoof impacted when it was frozen, of course, damaged it, but nothing that, caused a complete kill. And it did come back, but it was a little bit slow when we had a really cold period, when we got several days of, actually we got some icing events. And so this is actually regrowth after a week in one of those fields. And we did put cattle back out on that when it was that short. And so I would say we probably overstocked just a little bit. I think what I would do in the future is actually go to the equivalent of 6 calves and 3 acres, or you could think about it like a cow an acre or 2 calves an acre. I think that would have worked really, really well for us. So I wanted to show you how those calves perform. So they were 700 pounds when they went out there, and on the rye, triticale, and winter wheat, they really had no differences in gains, and they gained phenomenally. 4 pound a day gains, and these were limit fed to account for fill at the beginning and end. So these are true gains. I will tell you, however, that these calves had come off of corn residue and were limited on their gain to about 1 pound a day beforehand. So I think we did get some compensation when they went out there. You see the gain that we got per acre, again, phenomenal. And I will tell you, even with the grazing management we used, you can see the disappearance is quite high per head. That's not what they were actually eating. That's a combination of intake and then, of course, trampling. But that still doesn't look too bad. If we look at cost of gains, we had about $60 an acre in cost. If you kind of think about it that way, we had about $22 an acre in seed for the rye and the wheat. And for the triticale, it was a little bit more expensive, so about $28 an acre. Then we had our planting cost, fencing cost, and then I charged 25 cents per day in yardage. And if we look at cost of gain, just dollars per pound on the actual, you see really not much differences among the species, but really good cost of gains, 18 to 19 cents cost of gain. If I said I didn't have those calves having compensatory gain and I reduced my gain estimates by 25% to kind of account for that, still looks pretty doggone good. Now, most of you are probably going, well, I don't keep 700-pound calves around into the spring. And I understand that. I actually think that the performance that we're seeing here with these calves really tells you about the quality that we can get. If we manage accordingly, we can keep that forage vegetative. We can have really high quality. I mean, great for early lactation cows. I will tell you the one concern that I have is that if we think about the timing of when we can graze, so for the rye, we grazed actually from the first week of April, and then 2 of our paddocks kind of petered out, and we ended up having to pull off a little bit earlier. That's how we ended up having the same days of grazing between all 3 species. We stopped grazing May 15th and pulled off because we wanted to plant soybeans. And so this is not an indicator of how long the forage would have left or would have allowed us to graze. It was really a part of the system, and so we kind of moved off of it. We could have went longer, but for thinking about lactating animals, my one concern is that if we go onto this and then we move, say May 15th or June 1st, we're for most of our cow herds, we're moving into breeding. And if we have a really high planting nutrition before breeding and we don't continue that into breeding, we might have a little bit worse breed up than we want early on. And so want to make it clear that I don't think you'll have bad breed up if you breed it on this. I actually think you'd have really good breed up. I've seen some data that suggests that's true. But if you do graze this beforehand, say calve on this, which I know a lot of people like to calve on rye because you have clean ground, you have some high quality feed. I think it's a great opportunity. I do think we need to be very cognizant of what we go to after it. And so like if you're going to chase cool season grasses in your warm season pasture, make sure there's enough out there for them to get a full intake of it. Don't end up setting them back nutritionally when you're trying to breed them. I also wanted to show you the variety of rye we were using in that grazing trial was not Elbon, but we've done it with Elbon before and we get similar gains. So in this case, it was 3.2 pound a day gains. And these guys were not having compensatory gain. So I really think 3 pound a day gain is achievable with calves. So I think this is a great opportunity again for calves or thinking about your lactating cows. Now let's talk about silage. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was kind of the staging, just so we're all on the same page. So this is a picture of rye at boot stage. And by the way, this particular individual is fairly short, so don't let that fool you. She's a little bit under 5 foot actually. But boot stage is that no seed heads are out. Actually, you can kind of see here that there's a little swollen spot in the pseudostem here, and that's where that seed head is. It's just not quite made it up to the collar yet. So that's boot stage when I talk about boot. The next stage I'm going to talk about is anthesis. And anthesis is basically, sorry about that. Anthesis is basically when the pollen is out. So when you see that pollen, these nice little yellow things out here, that's anthesis. So the head is fully out and we started pollinating. Then the next stage that we're going to discuss is milk. And so with milk stage, what you would have is in those seed heads, you could take out the seed and basically when you pinch it, a milky substance will come out of the seed. This is actually a picture of that wheat that we had planted at milk stage, and actually it lodged not quite considerably. The other species didn't do that, but the pronghorn wheat that we used actually didn't hold up so well. And then the last stage we're going to talk about is soft dough. So again, you take that seed head and you pull that seed out, and when you pinch it, you're going to get more of a dough than, and it's going to be nice and soft than if if you were looking at more watery, more milky. So those are kind of the stages. And this is actually, in this case, for this particular trial, we planted October 15th, and we planted the rye, triticale, and wheat on the same day. And this is actually when they hit their various stages. This was one of the questions we had. For instance, is rye better because it's going to come on earlier? That was one of my thought processes. If I was to think through this, I would have thought rye would come on the earliest and be done the earliest. Wheat would be the latest coming on and the latest to get through all the stages. And I was wrong. This is a northern type rye. It came on the same time as the winter triticale, and it was about 4 days earlier than the wheat. So not a huge difference there. And also, as we look at how they move through the stages, one thing I want to point out is they move very rapidly from boot to soft dough. So we have basically a month to get through all those stages. And when you start looking at the difference between each of them, we're a week to 2 weeks. So they can move very, very quickly. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges in my mind with making silage is if I have in my mind, I want to go for milk, and I get started, let's say I get my machinery ready and then it rains, well, I might end up hitting it soft dough. So I think as we talk about making plans, you want to make sure you're on top of things so you don't let it get away from you. One thing I did want to show you though is that the wheat actually came on a little bit later and ended up finishing a little bit earlier. So it's actually more compressed than the other species were. And so the risk of not hitting it when you're targeting is actually a little bit higher with wheat in this particular instance. Okay, so then I wanted to show you the moisture contents because I think this is a big one. The biggest mistake I see producers make with trying to use small cereals for silage is they want to direct cut it and they hit it at, oftentimes they're going to hit it somewhere around anthesis. So the heads are out and they're like, okay, it's time to go. And look at that moisture content. It's way too wet to do that. If you want to harvest at boot or anthesis, you really have to cut it and let it wilt. Now it doesn't take a long time for it really to dry down into a spot where we can actually harvest, but you can't direct cut it. You need to wilt it. So you got to cut it and then you can chop it after it's dried down. Milk, on the other hand, you can direct cut, and we did direct cut it. And soft dough, you can direct cut. I will say that it starts getting fairly dry, and there is some risk of targeting soft dough and it getting too far along. So again, I think we need to be very careful and maybe shoot for, oh, it hit milk, it's time to go, and hopefully you'll get it by soft dough. So this is the yields that we got of the various species. And I think the thing that really I want to point out to you is I just don't see a huge difference among the species. There was something going on here with the wheat at soft dough. We didn't get as good a yield as we did the rye and triticale, but I just really didn't see a lot of differences between the rye and triticale. We're repeating this. We'll see how it looks this year. But I didn't see huge differences between rye and triticale that made me decide which one was better, which I thought was kind of interesting. I expected triticale to do much better than the rye. Interesting note, most of you have probably looked at rye and said, well, I mean, I see the fields and they get mature so much more quickly than others, like triticale. And the thing that we noticed is we had some triticale plots that we did not fertilize versus ones that we did. And we saw that triticale went through its maturity stages much more quickly if we had not added nitrogen to it. So I think the big difference in a lot of fields that we see with rye getting mature super quickly is fertility, that the plants, saying, well, life is not all that great and I don't have that much more I can do given the nitrogen that I have available. So we're going to go and put on seed. So I thought that was kind of something that was really useful. So fertilization may help with yield. It may also help just allow you to have a little bit longer window to get it harvested when you want, in terms of the stages that you want it to be harvested at. Okay, so of course we'd expect yields to be best the later we go. So soft dough yielded the most. That's not really all that unexpected. And between milk and soft dough, we gained about a ton. Between boot and soft dough, we over doubled those yields. Crude protein wise, these did have 60 pounds of nitrogen added to them per acre. So crude protein wise, really high early on, which you would expect. I didn't get analysis of the wheat at boot. That was my mistake. But if we look at soft dough, we're still pretty good. 10% that's good feed. So I think that one doesn't really dictate it when you might decide to harvest. But I did want to show you, this is barley because I don't have the digestibilities of those 3 species from that silage done yet. But I wanted to show you what happens because it's a little different than what you might think about with perennial hays, in that if you think about heading, which that would be just a little bit before anthesis, flowering would be anthesis, milk and soft dough, you can kind of see this is in vitro organic matter digestibility. So this is kind of the energy content. It's not quite TDN. It's actually a little bit higher than what our TDN values. You could probably take off about 2 percentage units and be about TDN. But you see here that it was 62 at heading. It dropped down to 54 at flowering, and then at milk, because we're now getting a little bit of starch production in that seed, we get up to 60. And then by soft dough, we have even more starch production. We're now at 62. So here it's all about the forage being quite digestible and so high energy. And here it's because we're starting to get some starch in it. And then if you miss soft dough, now you've lost your quality again. So milk and soft dough, in my mind, are great opportunities for harvest. You can get good yield, you can direct cut, and you can get good quality. And so I think those are great things to be targeting. So I tried to speed up and get us back on time. If we have a few moments, I'd be interested in taking a few questions.
Mary, you did a great job helping us out on the time. One question, as people are starting to throw some of their other questions in the Q&A box, something that comes to my mind as far as trying to help producers answer questions. What does a mineral program look like? Does that change when you're looking at grazing these smaller cereals, or even using them as a silage program?
Yeah, so that's a great question. In fact, there's some really great data from south of here, looking at, for instance, grazing these immature small cereals. And this is the one time where a gain response can be immediately seen by providing a mineral. So salt's as part of that equation. And in fact, they have shown they can actually get a gain response due to just providing salt with calves out on small cereals like wheat. But manganese is the other big one, which is one we don't think about for calves. So we actually provide a high mag mineral when we're out on those small cereals grazing, even if it's not lactating cows. So even if it's calves, I still go get a high mag mineral and put it out. So that would be the first thing that I would think about. In terms of ideas for if I'm using it as silage, it really kind of depends on who you're feeding it to. But again, these are going to be fairly high in potassium. And so especially if it's for lactating cows, I would really look at the magnesium. And then I still would like to have, of course, copper and zinc in there because those are usually deficient. So salt, magnesium, copper, and zinc are the two are really are the ones I pay attention to. And then one more would be actually calcium and putting a little bit of calcium in that mineral. Most high mag minerals are, 5 or greater % calcium. So usually you're going to hit that no matter what you're doing.
No, that's interesting because, whenever you're thinking about a forage-based feed stuff, that's not naturally where your thoughts go, is to make sure you're keeping those calcium levels in that mineral program.
Yeah, exactly. It's not usually a big concern, but these guys are really interesting because they have they don't have a lot of some of the electrolyte minerals except for potassium. So, and that potassium, of course, with the high nitrogen, does the same thing as what you think about with grass tetany and in cool season grasses in early spring, where you can see that with lactating cows. So definitely with lactating cows have high MAC, but even calves, because usually you don't really worry about it. If I'm grazing stockers out on a cool season, I don't worry about grass tetany. And that's not really the issue. What you do see is a reduction in gain.
Absolutely. No, and I think your point that you mentioned early on in your presentation about, not everyone always keeps the 700-pound critter around, but at the same time, I think that just shows you how good a quality of feed you were able to put in front of that animal. And
Yeah,
still,
I think for most guys it fits for a lactating cow. Actually, even developing heifers. Last few years we've been developing heifers on oats and brassicas in the fall, and there's some people who are concerned about doing that. We don't breed on it, but we've been developing them, and then of course they're breeding in May, and it's a very cost effective system because you can get really good gains, and then you can kind of for the rest of the winter you don't have to supplement them as much. You can kind of get lower rates of gains and just still hit that target mature body weight.
awesome. Very good. If you've got any questions for Mary, be sure to go ahead and put them in that Q&A box. I'm going to ask her to stay on for a little bit and be sure she can monitor that. We've had some really good conversations going on there. Mary, thank you so much for being with us today and for your great presentation.
No problem.
All right. Moving into our next talk, we've got Dr. Bob Cushman, and I'm going to go ahead and invite him to start sharing his screen if he would like, his slides. Dr. Cushman is a research physiologist at USD Agricultural Research Service located at Clay Center, Nebraska. He brings to the table over 20 years of research and development experience. Currently, he serves as project leader for the strategies to improve heifer selection and heifer development, focused on identifying genetic and environmental factors influencing reproductive efficiency in beef cows. The team is particularly interested in identifying genes and genetic markers associated with reproductive aging. As the leader of this team, they are working to develop genomic tools to improve reproductive management decisions in producer settings. Dr. Cushman, thank you for being with us today, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you. You can hear me?
I can hear you. Right now, I am seeing the presenter side of your presentation, not the review or the viewer side of it.
You are seeing the presenter side. Okay, what if I do this? Okay, that did that. Let's try again. How about now?
Perfect. You're good to go.
Excellent. Other than I'm not advancing. It's a good thing that I'm short too, in terms of time. Let's see what happens now.
Bob,
Oh, go ahead, Mary.
I was going to say, you just need to click back on your slide again. So like,
There you go. Perfect. Thank you, Mary.
You got it? Okie doke. So if I seem a little jet lagged, that's because at 7 o'clock this morning, I was in Lavras, Brazil, teaching a class on heifer development, and I got to be back there at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. But I do appreciate the invitation, and I appreciate everybody's time. Hannah did a great job of introducing me. Again, I'm amazed at the information she had, because I didn't necessarily do any better than Mary in terms of providing information. I am the lead scientist on the project plan that she described, and just to describe a little bit my connections to UNL, I've been an adjunct professor at UNL since 2005, I believe it is. Some of what I'm going to discuss today has been done in collaboration with Dr. Cupp's lab. Some of it has been in collaboration with Adam Summers, who of course did his PhD with both Rick Funston and Dr. Cupp, and is now at New Mexico. And in addition, in terms of our ties to UNO, I'm really excited to say that my project plan has hired Alex Snyder, and she is going to be coming on as part of this project come January 1st. And with all due credit, she did help me put together this talk today. Okay, so how do we fit what I'm going to talk about into some of what we've already heard this morning? I'm going to be talking to some degree about developmental programming, and like Travis said, not everything we do has just an immediate response. There's quite often long-term consequences to the types of things we do, and we don't always think about that. And we need to keep in mind what those long-term implications of how we develop replacement heifers are. And then in terms of using a dry lot, it can definitely make the assisted reproductive technologies that Dr. McCarthy talked about just a little bit easier. And you'll notice that that is in quotes because I understand the pros and cons of easier, but we're talking about minimally at least animal access. So again, we can all discuss what we do and what we don't like and what does work and what doesn't work in any given production system. And I think we still basically come back to, in my opinion, every person has to decide what technologies they're going to use in their production systems, whether that be assisted reproductive technologies, whether it be estrus detection systems, and whether it be whether you are developing your heifers in a dry lot or developing them out on native range and that type of thing. So you're going to see some data in directions that can provide favorable views in one way and favorable views in the other way. And I don't know that I'm necessarily telling you that one way is better than the other. I'm just trying to show you the types of things that can happen. So again, I think in general, we can agree that developing heifers in a dry lot is not necessarily cost effective in all production systems. It's gonna be a bit more expensive usually. Although again, as the price of pasture keeps trending up, we keep asking that question of which is the better way to go. And as a primarily reproductive physiologist, I would still argue that it does give us a little bit easier access for assisted reproductive technologies, like Dr. McCarthy talked about. So detection of estrus, reproductive tract scoring, synchronization of estrus, artificial insemination, all those things become a little bit easier if the heifers are close at hand. And again, we actually use one of the Allflex systems, one of the previous systems in terms of our collection of data. I love it for at very least a research perspective, although I use it pretty well for a management perspective as well. So I can say that, but a lot of times we're looking at what our different genes and what our different management strategies and what our different nutritional strategies are doing to those endpoints that Clay talked about. What does it do to intensity of estrus, repeatability of intensity of estrus, interestrus intervals going into breeding, number of cycles? In a way, if you're in a dry lot, depending on how much time and effort you want to put into it and how much money you want to put into it, there's no question that you can definitely get probably a lot more information than you can out on that native range. Like I said, it makes it easier for the types of things I like to do, looking at development of the reproductive tract, and it makes it easier for synchronization and AI. And I realize AI, the word easier is in perspective, but relatively easier. You do have behavioral changes when you raise heifers in a feedlot, right? They get used to that idea of being fed. They get used to the sight of the feed truck. They don't necessarily develop the grazing behaviors that they're supposed to. And so if you're going to use AI, you got to keep this type of thing in mind in terms of when and how you breed them. And these are some data from Dr. George Perry's lab. Basically, it shows that when they raised the heifers in the feedlot and then sent them out to pasture for approximately the first 7 days, those heifers that had been raised in the feedlot and had no experience in a pasture were walking around looking for a feed bunk, looking for a feed truck instead of actually grazing. And in part of that study, they showed that when the heifers were AI'd, and I want you to think about this in terms of what Travis said, and I think both Casey and Mary may have gotten at it a little bit, we're not necessarily talking about conception rate, because in this case, those heifers would have been AI'd in the dry lot and then moved and then gone into their negative energy balance. And as they're losing weight during that first week while that early embryonic development is going on, most likely it's not that they didn't conceive, but it's that we lost the embryo. And again, Dr. Perry has some great data in subsequent studies where they flushed the embryos out and looked at the quality of them and showed that that negative energy balance started to negatively impact the development of that embryo and all that type of thing. So grazing is definitely a learned behavior. And if you're going to raise heifers in a dry lot, you're going to have to realize that you're going to need a strategy to be moving them back out onto pasture if you're going to do that, and what that's going to mean in terms of timing and when you can do that in your pregnancy or in your reproductive management scheme. So these are some data from Travis that again are really interesting. It was a comparison of 2 different wintering systems to a dry lot system, and it was looking at that long-term impact like I was talking about. So again, these heifers that were raised in a dry lot, you see that more of them fall out of the herd faster than heifers raised on stocks. And you've probably heard Rick Funston say through the years, you may have heard me, you may have heard Harvey Freetley say the questions about why does this happen? And actually some of these data were what we had at US Mark when I came on board and led to a little bit of what I'm going to share with you today. So if we use some of Funston's data, there is minimally a little bit of impact when you compare dry lot heifers to grazing heifers on the percent that were pubertal going to breeding. I know we've talked this morning about that idea that cyclicity plays a role. It does play a role. It's not always as huge, at least in our hands here at US Mark, as some people like to say it is. I think when you look at that AI percentage, you can come to the conclusion that if they're not cycling, at least by the AI season, you might have a small depression in that. But then when you look at those final data for the full season pregnancy rate, there's not necessarily a huge impact. So again, what are we talking about in terms of that stayability and why those dry lot heifers would not necessarily stay as long, especially, remember, if we're giving them the advantage on puberty. So all of this kind of suggests that it's not necessarily a puberty effect that is causing those dry lot heifers to fall out sooner. And then the next question becomes, can we prepare the dry lot heifers for this? So can we adapt them? Can we get them used to that idea that they might not be seeing as much food once we move them out onto pasture, whether it's before or after breeding and or later in their life? So most of you have probably seen these data through the years. This is a study from UNL that looked at 3 different ways of developing heifers, either with a constant gain type of model or one where they were held back early in the post-weaning period and then fed up to the end, kind of like a flushing type of situation, or whether they were fed a high rate of gain early and then only maintained going to breeding. And really overall in this study, there was no difference in age of puberty and no difference in pregnancy rate. So then when we look at these late gain models, this is the Lynch paper, which again, I'll bet a lot of you have seen before because of the impact of it. It says that that late gain can decrease feed costs by about 10% with no difference in pregnancy rate. So if we're a little bit concerned about those costs in the feedlot in terms of developing heifers, these begin to become the ways that we might actually be able to decrease those costs and get it somewhere in where it becomes acceptable, again, depending on which other management strategies we want to put with it and what our goals for our operation are. So this is the end of the story, truthfully, because this is current data that we're just getting ready to publish. But I want you to realize that Dr. Freetley had a lot of data that showed this exact thing even when I arrived here in 2003. And I can still remember that day in June in 2003 when I walked into Freetley's office and Funston was there and they were discussing this type of thing. So just to kind of orient you, since the name has changed, the stair step would still be essentially a late gain model, kind of like what I showed you from the Lynch data versus, versus the constant gain, which would just be that continuous gain that was on the Lynch and or Clanton data. But Freetley has shown through a number of studies that those heifers that are raised on the late gain, the stair step, have a greater herd survival rate than those that are just raised on a constant gain. So again, I want you to remember, none of these heifers are necessarily being starved or really restricted. They're just being grown more slowly with less overall feed. And all of these heifers are all in a dry lot. So we're comparing dry lot to dry lot. So this is not grazing behavior like I showed you. And Freetley and Funston were sitting there arguing to me that to some degree it was adaptation, that if you hold these heifers back, if you get them used to the idea of not eating so much, then when they're cows out on grass and it's a rough year, they are adapted and used to that idea. And I am not denying that I believe that that partially happens. It probably does. It partially plays into what we're showing you here. But I am a physiologist as much as anything else, and I like basic mechanisms, and I'm an ovarian physiologist, and I love what's going on there. And I was able to look at them and say to them, well, there's data in rats that shows that in the peri-pubertal period, if we decrease intake and decrease the total amount of energy that they consume, that it actually slows the depletion of the follicles in the ovary, okay? So not everything we do just has an immediate response. That's what we're showing you. What are the mechanisms? Are they adaptation, or are they physiology, or are they a combination of both, which is most likely the actual best answer? But again, getting back to where we were, for those of you who've never heard one of my talks before or aren't familiar with the microscopic populations of follicles, Casey did a really nice job of describing that large follicle that ovulates. But a mammalian female is born with a finite number of follicles in their ovaries, right? And this is the oocyte, the egg, inside a quiescent primordial follicle. They enter the growing pool by a process called activation, at which point you get these cuboidal granulosa cells, and then they begin to multiply. At the same time, the oocyte is growing and maturing, and if it goes all the way to the antral stage, that large fluid-filled follicle that Casey talked about, those ovulate. In mammalian females, one of the main mechanisms driving reproductive senescence, or if we're talking about higher level primates, menopause, is the depletion of these eggs in the ovary. And there is a lot of variation among females in terms of the number of eggs they have and how long that lasts and what that does to their fertility, okay? So this left panel kind of shows you a summation of at least the first three studies here, the Freetley, the Amundsen, and this study that was part of the Amundsen that we did in collaboration with Dr. Cupp's lab. So in the constant gain heifers, Freetley's targeting them mainly for about 1 kilogram, about 2 pounds of gain a day, versus about a half a kilogram in those stair step or late gain heifers from weaning until 11 months of age. And then we kick it up a bit from 11 to 13 months of age, trying to get them that energy to make sure that they're cycling overall and get them pubertal and ready to go to the breeding season, okay? And what I will tell you is through years and years of this study, the effects on puberty are minimal, just like what would agree with the Lynch paper and all of that type of thing. Sometimes there's a little bit of delay in puberty, but most of the time, all of these heifers are pubertal by the time they go to breeding. The way the intensive physiology studies work is that only Dr. Freetley knows when we collect ovaries, which heifers were on what diets, okay? So when the ovaries come into my lab and are fixed for histology and all the histological counts are done and all this is done, no one knows whether she was a stair step or she was a control until after all the histology is done. And this is actually our time course study. So this is from the Amundsen paper. And basically what it shows is that in those constant gain heifers, you have a decrease in the number of primordial follicles sometime between 11 months and 13 months of age, versus when you nutrient control them, limit feed them, hold them back, make them grow a little bit slower, it seems like we spare the ovarian reserve and they go into breeding with a greater number of follicles. And like I said, we have done this actually 3 times now, because like I said, Muhammad's experiment was actually a subclass of Olivia Amundsen's experiment, and what that really got at was some of these mechanisms and looking at what's going on down at the level of these tissues to understand what's going on. But we've done it 3 times now, and we've done it in 2 different locations minimally, right? We've done it out here at US Mark twice, and Shelby Rosasco is the PhD student, now assistant professor at Wyoming, with a PhD student with Adam Summers at New Mexico, who was crazy enough to want to try it again in New Mexico when she had spent some time in my lab. And I will tell you, I had braced Shelby the whole time for the idea that this was not going to work another time, because even though we've done it 3 times now, even though it's always been significant, I'm still not sure to this day I believe this is real, okay? That's how hypercritical I get in my data. Even though there's a whole bunch of mouse studies or rat studies to show it happens, I still can look at this and go, have we just gotten lucky by random chance 3 times, or is this real? And I say 3 times, so I give a part of the story away. So Shelby added one other question. She wanted to know if it would work the same way on native range as it did in these dry lot heifers. And that gets us back to some really quite interesting data. But again, just to make sure before we go to Shelby's study that you understand what we're talking about, in general, the reason I investigate and do these ultrasounds and look at antral follicle counts is, in general, heifers with greater numbers of antral follicles that you can see on the ultrasound screen have greater number of these primordial follicles. It results in data that I'm not going to show you today, but a uterine environment that is more supportive of early embryonic development. So that's part of how we believe it works. There's arguments on what happens with oocyte quality and the embryo itself, although data from our lab would show that the oocytes are actually better in these high AFC animals, and Alex will be working on some of the data sets we've already built up and some more of that as she comes on board here in January. And dating back to my PhD dissertation, for sure, it makes really simple sense. Cows in general with more follicles, if you super ovulate them, you're going to get an overall better response just because there's more follicles there to respond. So now that I've built up the suspense, here we go. Oh, no, I'm still building up the suspense. Sorry. I forgot. So the herd survival is greater in the stair-step heifers, but there's no difference in antral follicle number, no difference in calving day. So I've got to ask the question, is this just the better uterine environment that goes with that increase in primordial follicle numbers, even though there's no difference in antral follicle number? Now we go to Shelby's data. Sorry about that. So Shelby raised heifers either in dry lot or in native range, essentially using that same constant gain or stair-step model that we had, only she did this in New Mexico. I had warned her that this right here would not happen. I was absolutely positive it would not happen. And I wasn't sure, right? We were just asking here what would happen when they weren't in a dry lot, when they were on the native range. And I was just absolutely flabbergasted. Shelby came here, spent 6 weeks last fall, did all the histology. Again, she and I did not know which were her stair-step heifers and which were her constant gain while we were doing the histology. It was all blinded. And we got really some quite interesting results. We got results that would agree with our previous studies in terms of in a dry lot, we still get a greater number of those primordial follicles per section in the heifers that are raised on the stair-step compared to the constant gain. The constant gain on native range was a little bit more intermediate. You could almost say they weren't negatively impacted. I can lean toward that with, again, stair steps on native range being at the top of it all. Going back to Casey's talk a little bit about the hormones and the follicles, we all know that that large dominant follicle is really important for prepping the track for pregnancy, like Casey said. That's partially due to the estradiol, and Dr. Perry's group has shown through the years that AI percentage and all that type of thing is much better when you have a good large follicle that's producing lots of estradiol. So hopefully I haven't gotten too far down in the weeds of reproduction for you guys to follow. But basically these heifers were killed at 36 hours after the luteolized shot in a synchronization protocol, like what Casey described. And again, for no reason that I was expecting, sometimes research just surprises you. What we see is a larger follicle diameter overall in those heifers that were raised on the native range compared to the heifers that were raised in the dry lot, right? I really definitely was not necessarily expecting this. And to some degree, in agreement with that, this is the estradiol and the follicular fluid. So it's showing that those follicles from the native range are not only larger, they're producing more estradiol, they're providing a better microenvironment for that egg to grow in. Obviously, we did not send any of these animals to breeding. So I am just telling you that if we use indicator traits, it overall looks like heifers developed on native range, regardless of stair-step or constant gain, were more reproductively ready to go to breeding than the heifers that were raised in the dry lot. And like I said, this wasn't even necessarily part of the hypothesis. It wasn't necessarily where we were going, but I do have to admit we found this very, very intriguing. And so, you know, Shelby had to defend her PhD a little over a month ago or so, and she had to deal with what to make of all of this. And I think one of the take-home messages that we've decided that there's still a lot we do not know about developing replacement heifers in a dry lot or on that native range, because the question would be, why was ovarian development better on native range? And I mean both in terms of ovarian reserve and in terms of at least ovarian reserve in those constant gains, right? As well as the diameter of the follicle and the estradiol production. It just kind of actually argues to you that our heifers do sort of belong out on forage. Not that I'm not picking a management system, I'm just showing you the data. Because I can still argue that if we're doing this right, we should be able to do it in the dry lot too, right? And so Freetley has asked me a lot of times in the last month, are we missing something or feeding too much of something in the dry lot in terms of trying to understand Shelby's data? And I think it comes into that. And since Spangler isn't here today, but he loves to always kind of play devil's advocate in terms of production systems and in terms of where we're going, I think to some degree in the next system or section, Spangler always likes to challenge that idea that not everyone belongs in the heifer development business, right? And I guess I would say that I think I'm pretty good and pretty well educated at heifer development, and yet here I am stumped by my own results. So Spangler's argument that not everybody belongs in the heifer development business and we don't completely know what we're doing, the one good thing it does is it says I probably still have room for research and reasons to keep going. And Shelby is getting ready to do a new stair-step experiment in collaboration with us next spring out in Wyoming. She's going to have the stair steps and the constant gain. She's going to have native range and dry lot. We are going to collect uterine tissues this time and see if the uterine environment really is better, both between the stair steps and the controls and between the dry lot and the native range. But getting back, you know, Spangler would always argue that we need to be going to a production system that includes terminal crosses. So if you buy that bred 3-year-old and you're not creating them yourself, then you can either be using AI and selecting for bulls for carcass and growth, maybe putting sex semen on that so that you're definitely generating steers and in no way harm or hurt your female reproductive performance. So if all of that wasn't too chaotic because of my jet lag and or slight confusion on getting it up and going, I would be happy to try to answer any questions either this way or online, and welcome any comments anybody has.
Thank you, Dr. Cushman. That was awesome. Yeah, so if you have any questions, go ahead and drop that in the Q&A box. I'm going to go ahead and lead off with a question if that's okay, because I think you bring up such a good point. I'm not saying Spangler's right, but you know, not everyone's going to develop their own heifers. And as that happens, somebody else has to be developing that animal for them. And, you know, as resources become more limited or people look for ways to get back into the industry, you see those heifer development opportunities popping up. And so I guess my question for you is are we doing a disservice based on your data by pushing more towards that dry lot system that people try to do, even in a high forage diet environment?
So first of all, yeah, I hate to actually admit that Matt's right, although actually I love it, and I have never denied when he's made those arguments in the room that it's potentially true. In terms of the actual part of your question, I'm not completely sure. It keeps me in a job, right? Because I'm a researcher working on this type of stuff, so it gives me more questions and that type of thing to answer. But there are going to have to be people that are developing heifers, and I really think that the idea is to realize that there's still a lot we don't know. And I think Freetley's partially right that we're still not feeding the dry lot heifers correctly. And I don't mean in terms of amounts, because again, actually less and more is my least favorite type of nutrition. That's why I work with nutritionists. I am still a physiologist and a biochemist and or a developmental programmist. And it's like, let's get down to what the components within the feed are and what they are doing particularly. So I think he's right. I think that however we're doing that in the dry lot, we're either feeding too little of something or too much of something, and that is where we need to get to, if in any way that actually helps answer your question, Hannah.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of a follow-up to that, in one of your graphics there, you had you were comparing the stair step versus the constant, and you were putting them in the brackets of 8 to 11 months of age, and then I think 11 to 13 or 15 months of age. Right. So when you're talking about this dry lot, put a little bit more parameters for us as far as when these animals walk into the dry lot and are eating 100% out of a bunk, compared to the ones that might just be on range. Is that a immediate post-weaning situation? For
us, yes, it's an immediate post-weaning situation for these studies. For some of the other ones, we still kind of do it a little bit more slowly, but they would come in really closer to about 7 months, and then they're slowly built up to what the diet's going to be. So you almost have a stair step on the front end as well as a stair step on that transition, right? Because you kind of have to be a little bit careful with the energy in all these cases. But that's why we actually start the protocol at around 8 months of age. So everybody that's coming into the dry lot has come in, they've gotten adapted, and then we start putting them on the 2 different rates of gain, get them to about the halfway point, give or take a little bit, and then bring the ones that have been gaining more slowly up to speed with that flushing. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Okay, well, if Dr. Cushman, if you don't mind, and I know we're kind of pushing your limits today, but if you could hang around for a few minutes just to kind of monitor that Q&A box for us as people start to think about that.
Yep, will do.